Fireside Chat is Patriarchy and the Shaping of Samaaj, Sarkaar and Bazaar. I'd like to call to the dais my esteemed speakers, Professor Rajeev Gowda. Professor Gowda was a member of the Rajya Sabha from 2014 to 20. He represented the Congress from Bangalore North in the 2024 Lok Sabha elections. From 2023 to 24, he was Vice Chairman of the Karnataka State Policy and Planning Commission with the rank of a Cabinet Minister. He is the National Spokesperson for the Congress and the Chairman of the party's Research Department, and was the convener of its Manifesto Committee for the 2019 Lok Sabha election. From 2000 to 2014, he was Professor of Economics and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, where he also launched the India Women in Leadership Program for Women Political Leaders, and also served as the chairperson for the Center for Public Policy. He has published widely on public policy themes, such as how people and societies manage health and environmental risks, and has made seminal contributions to the literature on Indian electoral reforms. He has been a director on the Central Board of the Reserve Bank of India and of the General Insurance Corporation of India. Welcome, Professor Gowda. Next, I'd like to call Mr. Dilip Cherian. Dilip Cherian, India's renowned image guru, is a seasoned bureaucrat, editor, entrepreneur, and media commentator. As founding partner and group chairman of Perfect Relations Private Limited, he pioneered image management in India, advising over 800 CEOs, political parties, and over 300 brands. A political and policy expert, he has served as an independent director on media boards like Radio 1 and Jagran Prakashan, and is a board member of the Bajaj Corp Limited. He also sits on industry boards including ASCI and NID. A thought leader, he advises GITEM University and Kautilya School of Public Policy and supports non-profits like MAP and Yuva. Welcome, Mr. Cherian. And lastly on the panel, I'd like to call Mr. Anish Gawande. Anish Gawande is a writer and translator based between Mumbai and New Delhi, a Rhodes Scholar with degrees from Columbia and Oxford. He is the co-founder of Pink List India, the country's first archive of politicians supporting LGBTQ+ rights. He currently serves as the national spokesperson for the NCP SP. Welcome, Anish. Please come to the dais. And with them, I'd like to request Lora Prabhu and Sara Abdullah Pilot from CEQUIN to please join us once again. Round of applause, folks. Thank you. This is the next Fireside Chat, Patriarchy and the Shaping of Samaaj, Sarkaar or Bazaar.
Yeah, it's been a power-packed morning and some more power-packed conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. So this is really going to be a conversation, and I'm just going to throw out some questions, and feel free to any of you. I don't want to like pointedly kind of ask the questions, so I just kind of do the conversation starters, and we can take it around from there. So man is the default mode, right? How we understand the world. It's the men who wrote the histories, the men painted the world for the way we comprehend it today. All the institutions, the institutional discourses, everything's been shaped by men. So is that, so how do we look at it? How do we, when we're navigating it with a gender lens, how do we even start unraveling that and reimagine the world that we see? Your thoughts on that? We can just, maybe, Rajeev, do you want to start?
I was just thinking when you asked that question as to who did the cave paintings? Did the women who heard stories about the hunt put it together, or did the men come back and paint tales of their glory? Be interesting. But since you're asking about current times, certainly the current times are overwhelmingly and undeservedly biased onto one side. Okay. Now, unfortunately, in an audience like this, everybody is talking so much political correctness that truth finds it very hard to squeeze through. Because if you use the wrong word, you'll get pilloried by a whole bunch of people here who say, this insensitive character is sitting there and talking complete sort of, antediluvian rubbish. Okay? But look at the world around you. I was telling Rohini as I walked in that I felt so good seeing that there was this woman who was going through the security before me, and she smartly put her metro card into one pocket and then put her phone in the other pocket, and she was free from having to carry this regulatory purse. So Rohini, in her usual brightness and wit, turned the whole thing around and saying, no, we're actually trying to create a world where men are comfortable carrying men bags. So I said, actually, it's about the market, the bazaar, since we talked about it. And she said, today, saris have pockets. How many ladies here have kurtas with pockets? That's good. And the salwar with pockets? Okay, whatever you wear, okay. But if you're wearing certain kinds of things, pants, whatever, okay. So I think that it's very important that the bazaar helps to push this needle to make sure that you have what it takes. Unless you have both hands free, you're not going to be able to fight for equality. That's the point I was making. You need both hands free to keep yourself safe for a start, but also to assert that equality. There's lots more to say, but I'm going to let the other voices go forward and not monopolize the mic like men do.
Lora, I think that what you're saying is true. Historically, that's been the fact. But that doesn't mean that we've got to accept that we're looking at the future. So if you just think about India's own history, the last 75 years, we didn't start by saying, well, our cultures, our religions, our traditions, privilege one gender over the other. We said right up front that we'll give everyone the right to vote, for example. We put in place in the preamble things like equality of status and of opportunity. So those sorts of, so it's a question about what's your vision. And then can you articulate that vision and turn it into reality? So one part of it is how you spread that word, and the other is how you implement that vision. So if you actually look at, say, Panchayati Raj, and the fact that across Indian states, you have 50% participation by women by mandate, and maybe sometimes more, where you actually have mandates that say this election, a Dalit woman will be the village chief. This is a massive social engineering, experiment, but we haven't shied away from it, and it is going to work, well or otherwise. It's something to be examined. But the fact of the matter is, whatever the historical baggage might be, there's no reason why we, as policymakers, or cannot think about changing Samaaj, changing how the world evolves going forward. And I think that's what we're focused on as a nation.
I want to just say that it took a while for women's pants to get pockets, and I think that's the challenge that we're facing, right? That keeping men in decision-making rooms only is a bad idea. It doesn't work. It's not great to have only men there, because only when you started having women be a part of the conversation did you start seeing these changes being implemented, right? And they sort of bleed into all kinds of other sectors as well. I think today we're having a lot of conversations around DEI and how DEI is a terrible thing. But it makes common sense to have DEI and have diverse people at the table. I mean, a great example somebody gave me was about AI models that were using law enforcement, that were being used by law enforcement companies to sort of track crime. And these AI models were only fed images of black people breaking cars. So when white people broke cars, they never recognized it as a crime. And this was where the lack of having diversity on that table, of having some engineer who would recognize that there's a problem with feeding data that's biased, led to very stupid consequences of not being able to prevent the crime that you were trying to prevent with this AI in the first place. So I think in some ways, you're very right that we need to change these systems and we need to get more people to the table. And Prof. Gowda, I want to sort of echo what you're saying. It's not easy. Listen, at the end of the day, I might be a gay man, but I'm still a man. And things like the Panchayati Raj system, which reserves seats for women or seats in municipal bodies, hurt men. These are not decisions that men take very willingly, right? But there has to be a moment where we acknowledge that even if it's not in my interest, I'm going to be doing something that is in the broader interest. And I think that's where this sort of it's a man's world needs to shift. And it's not always a very easy shift.
When you talk about though this idea of it being a man's world, and Dilip also going on from what you were saying about being politically correct, or I mean, what is politically correct at the moment? And we've all seen those scenes in America with Musk, with his child on his shoulders, or even at the recent meeting with our Prime Minister, and again Musk, and on the other side were his children and his nannies. And one really wonders that if he was a woman who was standing there, if that was Kamala Harris, for example, or Hillary Clinton, who was standing in the White House with her child, Chelsea, on her shoulders, would there not have been a lot more that people said about it? Or do you think it's just that it's all acceptable now, so even if a woman was standing there with her nannies and her babies, it would be okay? Is it?
If she was the richest creature on the planet, it would.
So it's all
One.
about the money.
Two, it would also lead to a different set of memes and conspiracy theories as to whether he was carrying the child as a form of protection from assassination, all kinds of wonderful theories that crop up. But I think that where we are confusing the issues is that policy making needs to begin from the top. If we are waiting for the kinds of policies we are looking at to happen with all of you pushing or resisting change, it ain't going to happen. It's only going to happen if you put a bunch of decision takers in the room, even if they are majority men, and show them reasons why, or a logic why. Dr. Sen gave many examples of that. Why this is not going to work in the future. The non-sustainability of it is the answer. And I think we need to be influencing more and more decision makers and making them feel, sense, and understand what the pressure is. Because what Rajeev said about the future casting is done by policymakers who haven't seen the future, but are at least reading the present correctly. Problem is today we are not giving them enough data to read the present correctly and then make the corrections needed.
Just to answer your question directly, I think if any woman politician had been in that place, there would have been criticism. And for all of us, this was actually quite stunning. What was a child doing at a meeting our Prime Minister was attending, for example? And what does that do to protocol and all the formalities that go into, high-level diplomatic engagements? So it's actually, he's broken certain stereotypes in such a way that none of us know what the hell's going on and where is it going. But as Dilip said, he's the richest man who seems to have tremendous influence on what's happening in the United States. So he seems to be getting away with a tremendous amount. But anyone else would have been very, very significantly criticized. Not just women, I think even men.
But that's oddity, right? Like actually the ideal Indian politician is the 56-inch ki chhati, strong, very masculine, and who kind of forsakes his family for the welfare of the nation. That's valorized, that's the ideal. On the other hand, women politicians really cannot escape from their glorified roles as wives and mothers. I mean, they have to embrace it. They have to, have their sundoor in their hair, or, be shown as loving and performing their domestic duties. And that's where the contradiction is, because you know, we had Jacinta, you know, there, you know, New Zealand, where she's actually with the child in the parliament. Actually, I disagree with her over there. I think it's a really powerful statement of embracing your domestic role while you're also straddling your professional roles, because women are doing it all the time in the streets, in the you know, in the farms. They have their babies at the back and they really work hard. But for men, they can't. Now, I'm not sure if Elon Musk really served that purpose of saying that he shares in the domestic role. But I just wanted you all to comment on, you know, what's the ideal male politician, especially somebody like you who's very comfortable with, you know, who he is as a man. How do you navigate that in public life?
You know, honestly, I think the first thing to start off with would be that the problem starts at the bottom, not only at the top. So the first thing you notice when you work in politics is that there are only men everywhere, right? From Karyakarta to the people working in the offices, to the people working in policy making, it is heavily dominated by men, right? And that makes it a very strange space to work within, even for women. So in many ways, you're seeing this sort of culture of masculinity become a part and parcel of politics. Now, how do you change it? I think you change it very subtly, right? So I remember when I sort of was campaigning with the Congress party in Maharashtra in 2019, I had just come back from the US. I was sort of very out, and it required me to reinvent what I was going to wear on a campaign trail, right? That I wasn't going to wear a white kurta, white pajama, but I was going to carry a little bag around. I wasn't going to be hyper-masculine. And slowly but surely, those questions started emerging within everyone there. They also emerged in conversations we were having, right? I think when you're part of a progressive political party, it's much more difficult to have these conversations than when you're on the other side, because very often you would see the sort of locker room conversations existing in your own colleagues, right? In Maharashtra, you had comments being raised about Devendra Fadnavis's wife. How can she do that? How is she not wearing a padar? How can she be making Instagram reels as the chief minister's wife? And sometimes you have to speak out against those things as well. And so I think it changes very slowly. I think I'm at a point now where I've realized that the best way to change this is, instead of saying, how do we include more women, how do you start working for more women? So my boss is a woman, and I think that's the greatest way to sort of ensure that there's more representation in politics. And you see the difference that makes. Right? And I think in many ways, the way to change it is by recentering even how we think of ways to progress in politics, right? I think very often you sort of work with somebody you're always thinking of, and I thought of this as well, and I met him. You're thinking of working with Shashi Tharoor and being an intern in his office, and that's the way to progress in politics. But very, very rarely will you see someone thinking that, oh, I want to work with a woman politician, right? Very rarely will you see someone, even in a constituency, saying, oh, let me like support a woman to become corporator today so that she will support me tomorrow. When in reality, actually, women are much better at ensuring people who support them get further ahead. I mean, no offense to the Congress party, but I was there for 10 years, didn't get much. Within 3 months of joining the NCP SP, they made me national spokesperson because my boss was a woman, right? So, you know, I mean, there's a real way in which working for women pays off better. It makes political sense to work for women, right? Because they recognize talent better, and they don't expect you to be like following them around and carrying their bag, because they're very used to carrying purses.
You know, I want to take that point further. When Dr. Sen talked about, and I'm trying to relate it to the past session so there's a sense of continuity, about having to change nappies despite having to go to office the next day, policy making and this equality and Musk aside, you know, if men were to get the same number of days off as maternity leave, as paternity leave, then there would be no question of their sharing the work equally. At least then they don't have the excuse that they have to go off to work. Musk, for example, is doing a whole bunch of things which we are not even talking about choosing the sex of his unborn children, making sure that he has more males than girl children, etc. So the kind of offensive behavior there, and I call it offensive behavior, because we have to call that out and see it for what it is. It is the obsequiousness of the world to money, to position, and then to bad behavior. All three we bow to. And that needs to stop. And you know, taking it up is one thing, but I think rulers, irrespective of sex, need to come down harder on it. It can't be done by ordinary people.
The challenge there, Dilip, is that the ruler in the United States context is a convicted rapist, and the people, you know, so what are you going to expect from that kind of a situation? And I sort of jumping a little further, taking this forward, the two dimensions I want to bring to your attention. One is, you know, circumstances demand different kind of images, right? So if you spent a few years attacking the UPA and calling it corrupt and inept and this and that, then somebody else with 56-inch chest shows up and says, I'm going to fix everything, then that's the image that that people may actually prefer. On the other hand, in a situation where, you know, people are all filled with hatred and violence, then someone who says Muhammad ka dukan is also someone who might actually find favor. So all these images as such may be responsive to the context. But there, again, in the Indian tradition, we also have very commanding women figures, right? So when Indira Gandhi split Pakistan, then Vajpayee hailed her as Durga, right? So those sorts of concepts and role models, as it were, are still very much, you know, things that people can relate to. So I'd say that's, you know, I don't think everyone is expecting a, you know, hyper-masculine leader necessarily. Also, people want somewhat caring, responsive leadership. People who will actually talk nicely to you when you go there, rather than just command and order you around. And what shall we say, if you see what goes on the ground, you know, there are a lot of people who are in politics who are, you know, essentially breaking the rules. So that requires a different kind of personality and image projection and things like that. But that society has to fix. You've got to elect people who aren't like that. Well, since I just saw that we're running out of time, I want to mention one more thing. Since we were talking about Elon and Trump, etc., it's not just those two guys, right? If you think about, you know, you've used the word bazaar. Who are the aspirational role models for a large number of people, say in Bengaluru, where I come from, in, you know, with the startup hub and things like that? Everyone wants to be a tech billionaire or something like that. But each one of these guys, right? Zuckerberg talks about masculinity being more required in the workplace. You have Musk with all his complications. You have Bezos, who has his own insecurities about his own masculinity. All sorts of, you know, aspects about these, you know, potential rich role models that you don't want, you know, you wonder what message are their words and actions conveying to everyone who's aspiring to be like them. So it's a very, you know, crazy complex situation.
I just want to add on to that and say that we have a real crisis because all of these people are my friends and they're all watching the Joe Rogan show or they're watching Andrew Tate. And we need to stop podcasts. I think we need to stop giving men the rights to have a podcast because there's all of this work that's being discussed there that's re-ingraining this idea of masculinity being a good thing, about women being inferior, about how women's role is in the kitchen. And this is what young men are growing up on. And this is the challenge as well. That a politics of care, which we so desperately need today, has very few buyers, but also very few people leading from the front as examples to sort of ensure that it has more purchase.
So how do we change that, Anish? This is something that, you know, when we look at politics and we look at ministries, when ministries are being handed out, women and child ministry, oh, it's going to be given to a woman. It's not something that even the woman politician is necessarily aspiring to, let alone the men. But then you'll have the hard ministries, like defense. At the moment, we have a woman, she's the the finance minister, sorry. And it's like, wow, you know, that's that solid, hard ministry that a woman has gotten. But the opposite is not true. There aren't like the soft ministries, if we talk about soft skills, if we talk about care economy or anything like that, that the men are aspiring to, and yet there are these, you know, defense, finance, home affairs, that it's, you know, those are the ones that we want.
So how do we shift this? So when you talk about this, how does that shift happen in politics? Is it that the political parties have to be told, well, you have to put a woman in XYZ ministry, you have to put a man in charge of XYZ?
No, I don't think the answer is that easy, right? I don't think that just putting a woman in a hard ministry is going to make that ministry soft, or putting a man in a soft ministry is going to make that ministry hard. I'm realizing this is a... But I think the reality is that it's a question of what values do you prioritize. And these are difficult questions. I'll give you a very simple example. I've been someone who's been very against the death penalty for the longest time, since I was in school. This goes back to sort of retributive and restorative justice. And I remember being in Mumbai, growing up in Mumbai, and saying that even the death penalty for Kasab was not warranted. And it was controversial. It was difficult. In my role as a politician today, when I say that the death penalty for the rapist in Badlapur is not warranted, it's controversial. But it goes back to the values you prioritize. It goes back to the values of care that you center, regardless if you're a man or a woman. And I think that's the slow process that needs to continue for those soft ministries to be considered as powerful ones. And for these ministries like finance and defense to not have this grand position they do anymore. It's not going to happen overnight. And it certainly isn't going to happen by putting a woman in charge. We've had women chief ministers, and that changes some things, but it doesn't fix the problem overall. So unfortunately, the answer is much slower. But a commitment to a politics of care, to a politics of values, I think is what makes the difference in the long run.
Once in a while in my role as mentor to women politicians, aspiring women politicians, etc., I keep telling them that they should aspire to those so-called conventional hard ministries, and why the skills they need to bring to the table need to go beyond I'm a homemaker or whatever is in their biodatas. Okay? So it's a matter of projecting the right things. But also this business of retribution, if we go by the fact that men have to carry the burden for the fact that masculinity has created so much societal damage over so many millennia, then the business of sorting history by rewriting Aurangzeb is equally justified. If you opt for one, you've got to okay the other. Think about that. Because there is no getting away from the fact that the jerk that you want to accuse of being badly behaved today is not just coming from a long lineage, and you can't make him carry the burden of all of that. He's just a jerk, period. Stop. So I think we need to have the narrative change. You need to have the policy change coming from leaders. I would have liked to see the Delhi Chief Minister, for example, though she may not have many choices, to have more women in her cabinet. And you've got to be there as a leader and leading not just for your party or listening to the bosses of your party, but asserting yourself, and every single person in power needs to do that. And I think I'd like to see that happen, because I am convinced, just as Anish is convinced about the death penalty, that change must begin by the few people who get catapulted into power, and they must make much bigger efforts, visible, powerful efforts, and then be backed by all of you. That's what will change things.
I think we need to, as a society, reframe what's important. If children in this country are still wasting and getting stunted and things of that sort, there can't be a bigger tragedy than that. So anyone who takes on a challenge like that and helps to fix it should be that's the ultimate hard job. Okay. So I think that's something that we need to emphasize a lot more, rather than the mystique of finance, because no one understands what the hell is actually going on.
We were talking about policies. A lot has happened, around women empowerment. Like, there's been that awareness, a lot of legislations happened, and of course we see visible progress on a lot of fronts. But, what about focus on men? Because, when we started out, like, default mode is men, so you can presume everything's for men. But really, is it time for us to have some very special, customized kind of interventions with men and boys, and what would that look like?
Well, it's a very tough one, but just building on Dr. Sen's point that men have not had a general willingness to engage with their mental complexities and challenges, etc. And I think about 3/4 of suicides are by men in general. So there is a larger problem that people haven't addressed. And so I think more interventions of a supportive counseling side, all of those could make some kind of a difference. Otherwise, the other issue to think about, and this may be controversial, is when laws like the anti-dowry law, etc., get misused. You hear stories that they are being used to target people in a family fight and things of that sort. Then those sorts of issues, how are you going to fix them? That might require some attention.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very tricky one, right? Because that is the context of these conversations that we are having, that there is this huge pushback that, women are misusing the laws, it's being unfair to men. And, but the fact is that, I appreciate your point, Dilip, that you can't be held responsible for what's happened in the past. But for social change to happen, things are going to be kind of, in turmoil for a little bit. That sense of entitlement that men have. For example, we are all really waiting with bated breath to see how the women reservation is going to happen in Parliament, because we are well aware that the men are very uncomfortable. They feel that they are going to lose their seats. It comes from a sense of entitlement that this is my seat, right? So it is real, and at the same time, the anxieties are real. But how are we going to navigate this? How are we going to, actually make a case for these laws and for these affirmative actions? Because, kind of linking it to the other question that I had is that, what is it that women bring to the table? What are women politicians just like men when they come into power, or actually they bring something different, and does that diversity really help in overall terms?
Do leaders need to bring something different to the table is one of the questions you asked. I think they do bring something different to the table, okay? And I think that needs to be exalted, made more visible. But on the question of, whether what needs to be done at the broader societal level, how many ladies here have partners or spouses or boyfriends or whatever who actually watch Andrew Tate all the time? None? Okay. Yeah, no one's going to say, okay, fine. But the point I'm making is that we don't realize the level at which this is, it's not a pushback, it's a whole trend. It's, if it was a pushback, I would begin to be able to measure it, because that means there's something to push back against. But this is just a toxic thing that's spreading because of its sheer popularity, And who's watching it? It's all people who could potentially be in this room, because those numbers can't come from nothing. Okay? Those numbers are massive, and the influence is therefore huge. We need to look for those. That's why I always say, look for the data, look for the numbers. The numbers, unless they're cooked up as very often economic numbers are, the numbers otherwise don't lie. He talked about generations of deprivation. I was speaking with a doctor yesterday, and who said that on the national medical surveys, there are some things which now they are encouraged not to fill in. Some health parameters of children at age 5. But they have found that with 10 years of not having eggs on the midday meal scheme, you're actually creating a new generation of stunted idiots. Bravo. Wonderful. So we'll have a bunch of real morons to deal with. Short morons. So I'm saying, look at the data. It's telling you what everything that needs to be seen. And we need to worry. If I were you guys, I would be very worried. You are the future. You need to be very worried because these are the trends which are, becoming engraved in society. And this is going to be the pattern of the future. Anish.
I don't see, under the current set of incentive structures within the political realm, that women would do anything dramatically different from men.
But I think it's also a larger problem, right? I think even when you say, look at the data, the way that data is being read by those in power today comes from this space of selfishness. If you go back to the Bazaar, we're in an incredibly selfish age. We're taught that whatever benefits me is whatever should be law, whatever benefits someone else is not my problem, right? And that's where the sort of conversation around misuse of the Dowry Act comes in. It's where questions around, oh, why should we ban dowry if meher is allowed, or if alimony is allowed? If you're banning dowry, ban alimony as well. You know, we've entered this stage where the fundamental core principle of caring about someone else, even when that means sacrificing your own interests, is lost. You know, I was on another panel recently with Bachchu Kadu, who's one of the MLAs from Maharashtra, who's been one of the most vocal sort of defenders of disability rights. And he made a very powerful argument. He said, you know what, as a politician, it makes no sense for me to speak up about disability rights. When I go into a room and say that there's 100 rupees and there are 10 able-bodied folks on one side and 4 persons with disabilities on the other, politically, it makes more sense for me to go with the people who are able-bodied and give them that money because I'm going to get a majority on that spectrum, right? But the politics of care requires you to go beyond that electoral politics logic, but more importantly, it requires the other people, it requires those 10 able-bodied people to be like, no, we also support giving resources this way, because otherwise, as a politician, I cannot justify supporting the rights of a marginalized community if it's going to turn the majority against me. And that's where that shift needs to happen, and it's a much longer shift, unfortunately, and I fear we're treading very, very differently into a very dangerous direction.
This really reminds me, Anish, about what we heard this morning in our inaugural session, for those of you who were here, what Rohini was saying. And even this conversation that we're having about male politicians and female politicians, and do women bring something good, better or not to the table than the men? I mean, at the end of the day, isn't it that it's a person? You can have a good person, you can have a good woman who's a politician, you can have a bad woman who's a politician, or, you know, the same goes with the man. So what Rohini was talking about this morning, she was saying about remembering humanity, remembering that, and that's what you're also talking about. You were talking about values. If we go back to the values, then, I mean, all these discussions that we keep having, wouldn't it take care of a lot of these problems if we go back to ethics? I mean, these things about mask and all, and why are things so troubling? It's like what Dilip was saying, that, you know, just this obsession with money, the obsession with power. But if we go back to ethics, if we go back to values, if we go back to principles, if we go back to humanity, then so many of these won't be, you know, issues. And it's not even, it doesn't matter if it's a man who's running the defense ministry or is it a woman. But I don't think that's the world that we live in. We don't have too much time, so maybe we
Sarah,
can.
how are you going to inculcate those values? Are we bringing them into our education system? Are those values reflected in the religious and other stories that we are exposed to from childhood? So there is a real challenge, at least certainly in the Indian context, and from what he's saying in the Western context as well, that people are going to be hardened by certain other ideas compared to what we are striving for in this room. So it's a major challenge ahead of us. Yeah.
And I want to draw a real political point over here, as I can score one right before we sort of end, is that there is a deliberate attempt to erase these values. When there is an attempt to remove socialists from the constitution, it is not talking about an economic system, it's talking about that politics of care, because that socialist in the constitution does not mean a socialist versus capitalist economy. It imbibes within it the spirit of care that is intrinsic to that constitution, that is trying to be erased today. Because those in power know that the minute you have a politics of care, their political platform won't stand.
Yeah. I mean, because we're going to be going into lunch, but I think if we have time for maybe 2 questions, but please keep the questions short and no 3-pronged questions and 10-pronged questions. Yeah, 1 question per person, quick, like, let's do a, quick fire round or something. Let's do a quick fire, rapid fire, just to make it fun. Rapid fire questions.
I just want to say something as a person who has covered gender for almost 15 years now. It makes me very frustrated and not just a little angry that we're kind of pussyfooting around boys in this day and age when we're seeing the backlash. We're acknowledging a backlash against women, whether it is the US, whether it is Afghanistan, and whether it is India. And we're still kind of, what about the poor boys? I am hoping that this day's seminar, and thank you, Mr. Gowda, for bringing up that suggestion, that yes, I understand the need to talk to boys, and I hope we are able to reach, I think this is an institutional problem, because the problem is so vast. It can't be left to 1 or 2 NGOs, it can't be left to 1 or 2 philanthropists. It has, if the Delhi government can bring in a happiness curriculum, I see no reason why government schools should not have gender equity as a compulsory subject from class 1 to class 12. You can't leave it to parents. I'm sorry, Amit, you talked about parents, but it can't, because they're learning from the parents. Someone has to make them unlearn those lessons. So that was my suggestion, not really a question. Sorry, it's a bit...
Fully agree with you, with an exam at the end of every month and a compulsory exam at the board level. That would work. Make it actual. And this is where I say policy making matters. One line of a policy can make this change, and that's what you got to insist on with whosoever can make that change. All this is no good.
बस एक तो मुझे कुछ कहना था राजीव जी पे कि चूँकि हम लोग गोरखपुर से आए हैं, है ना, और वहाँ हम लोग वकीलों के साथ पिछले 11 सालों से काम कर रहे हैं, तो डॉरी केसेस वाले जो कानून है उसका यूज़ जो हो रहा है वो गलत हो रहा है. ये औरतों को सिखाते वकील हैं, है ना. औरतों को नहीं पता है कि उसको कौन सा कहाँ पे धारा लगाना है, लेकिन उनको सिखाते वही हैं. विक्टिमाइज औरतें होती हैं. एक तो ये बहुत इम्पोर्टेंट था बात. दूसरा प्रश्न था दिलीप जी से कि इमेज गुरु जो है, ये जो काम है ना, ये काम जो है वो आता है रुपया से, है ना. तो ये कितना एथिकल है, क्योंकि आजकल चाहे वो पॉलिटिक्स हो, है ना, चाहे वो कहीं भी हो, जो हम लोग इमेज क्रिएट करवाते हैं आप एज ए एजेंसी, उसका वैल्यू सिस्टम क्या है. क्योंकि पैसा जो देगा उसमें क्या आप निगोशिएट अपने वैल्यू से करते हैं बीइंग ए पर्सन. फिर आपका जो एक इंस्टीट्यूट है, जो आपका बिजनेस है, उसमें तो पर्सनल वैल्यूज और बिजनेस वाले वैल्यूज में क्या क्लैश आप मतलब होता है आपका?
क्लैश तो होता ही है. बिजनेस जब चलाना होता है तो वो क्लैश हमें दिखता है एंड हमें महसूस होता है. क्या कंक्लूजन होता है वो अलग अलग लोग अलग अलग डिसीजंस लेते हैं, पर इंडस्ट्री है.
Hello, my name is Ashish Bhamre. The question is for all three of you. One identity that we all come with is also the caste identity. And what role caste plays in the gender stereotyping and how it influences different decisions. And it's a very important tool for politics also. So what information can you provide about this?
Good afternoon. So I'm Vikram.
Hang on. Let's deal with questions as they go, otherwise we'll forget. On the question of caste, I think the same problem about reserving seats in parliament for women comes up when this whole rotation of seats based on reservation for caste comes in. Okay? So I think we need to recognize that this is a problem and politicians have to find an appropriate solution. I don't think the exact solution exists.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Vikram. So my question is more like opinion about you. So it's about unpaid work or unpaid service, particularly for from women to the Indian household, especially about the women who are completely economically dependent on men, like their husbands, and reducing their agency. So what's your opinion about this, and what's the status of this recommendation in our decision making?
Policy perspective.
I think it's a very complicated issue, but if women's work male member of the family of the elected woman representative who dominates and takes over, right? Anyway, so that is probably, that's a reality that we have to fight with. And that requires even the authorities who are working with the elected representatives to insist that certain people don't come into the room when the meeting is happening, etc. I mean, I have certainly seen change happen. You know, my corporator who became mayor was a very demure, soft-spoken person who, you know, wasn't even in public life. And then she turned out to be an outstanding mayor. So all in the space of one term. So I think, you know, creating the opportunity and the platform can make the difference. But then everyone else around needs to be supportive and, you know, recognize their authority derived from their electoral legitimacy. So it's a lot of work, and there's a lot of, you know, in the political world, people talk so loosely about women politicians. It's, you know, it's just a very, very difficult environment to sort of battle continuously.
And I want to just add that for this, you also need allyship. And just like women politicians need to hire more women, men in politics also need to sort of support women in politics. And the two men on this panel with me have been very, very good at this. Because Professor Gowda's office has mentored several people I know. And every time I get an email, it's from a woman in the office who's already getting roles and responsibilities, right? And is getting mentorship in politics that otherwise would not be possible. And DC obviously has been mentoring incredible young women and incredible women politicians as well. And so I think it's really important today more than ever before to sort of put your money where your mouth is and to say that if you can give that opportunity to somebody, if you can open that network, if you can extend that sort of call, that you have to do that, because otherwise it's not really going to change very quickly. I'm not just sucking up to them because I like them, but.
Thank you so much for that, Anish. We love it when panels end with a shout out to each other. So thank you so much. Huge round of applause for all the speakers and panelists. Can I request the CEQUIN team to please felicitate the speakers?